You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of the renewable energy transition and electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is proudly brought to you by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Switched On is also brought to you by GoodWe, the all-in-one ESA battery system safely powering Aussie homes, lowering bills and providing energy independence. Hello and welcome to Switched On Australia, which is recorded and produced on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. I'm Anne Delaney. Thanks for joining me. Electricity disconnections are meant to be a last resort in Australia. There are rules designed to protect people. Retailers are supposed to offer payment plans, hardship support, and only disconnect when there's no other option. And yet, it looks like disconnections are rising. There's definitely evidence of an uptick since late 2024 as households buckle under the combined pressure of rising energy bills and the broader cost of living crisis. But as my guest today points out, disconnections could just be the tip of the iceberg, an indicator of increasing energy debt and financial stress. And we're not just talking about inconvenience here. Research from RMIT shows that disconnections and even the threat of them can amplify stress, worsen health outcomes and deepen financial hardship. You might remember on a previous episode of Switched On, we looked at the appalling situation facing many First Nations communities on prepayment systems, where disconnections happen automatically and instantly when credit runs out. But today we're looking at a different part of the system, bill-paying customers, which is the majority of us, and we're supposed to be protected. My guest is Nicola Willand, Associate Professor at RMIT University, whose research sits at the intersection of energy, housing, health and equity. Her latest work digs into what's really happening behind the numbers of disconnections, what it tells us about the limits of Australia's consumer protections and how we compare with other countries. Nicola Willand, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
It's my pleasure.
Nicola, I just wanted to start by looking at the problem that we may have. Tell me, what impact do these electricity disconnections have for customers?
I think every one of us can just put themselves into that situation. You don't have a fridge. If you have a header tank like I've got, you won't have water. You don't have internet. You don't have a computer. You don't have television. You can't charge your phone. And that just spirals into all kinds of economic, social, and health problems. Imagine you've got your insulin in the fridge and that may go off, of course, the food as well. It's not just that they can't switch on their lights, it's just everything else. We are so dependent on electricity.
And I'm presuming that disconnections push already vulnerable householders deeper into what we're calling energy poverty.
Absolutely. So we call it energy poverty if you can't pay your bills and if you're stressed around paying of bills. But what a lot of householders do is that they compromise on buying the medication, for example, just to pay their bills. And if you're really disconnected from electricity, it doesn't mean your debt goes away. You still owe the debt. But it means you may not be able to work on your computer to earn money. You won't be able to charge your phone to get that call, to come to an interview, to get a new job, etc. So it really exacerbates the hardship that vulnerable customers are already experiencing.
Do we know how many people are getting disconnected each year and who they are?
When we did our research, the latest figure was 23,000 electricity customers in the Australian electricity market. We don't know very well who they are because we don't have access to that information. We know that low-income households are paying much more of their income on bills than high-income householders. We also know that low-income householders tend to live in poor quality homes. So they're probably living in cold homes or homes that are too hot if they don't feel comfortable in switching on their heaters or their air conditionings as well.
Am I right to presume that with the cost of living that the number of disconnections is going up?
I think that's the logical assumption, but what happened was that the Australian federal government introduced a bonus of, I think, about $300 for
Yeah.
every customer. So that actually outweighed it a little bit,
Right.
so we didn't feel it, but they haven't continued it. So that's why when the Reserve Bank was talking about inflation figures, for example, energy was artificially kept down because of this, but now it's being disconnected. So now it will go up, and then with that, the inflation rate goes up again. So it was that intervention from the Australian government that puffered it off a little bit.
So you've been looking at a number of European jurisdictions and how they deal with disconnections. Firstly, how do our rates of disconnections compare with those European countries that you've been looking at?
That's a really good question. So we really looked at the case where electricity disconnections were prohibited. So, and that means not just the fact that people were being disconnected, so banning that, but also if you know you're not going to be disconnected, that's going to ease the mental stress of fearing of being disconnected, because even just fearing the disconnection will mean that people's practices change, the way they spend money, for example, that this changes. So we looked at countries in Europe that European policymakers, but also advocates in Australia, had put forward as good examples, thinking they were going to be much better than Australia. And it was a bit surprising that it really wasn't that case. So we looked at France and Spain and Ireland. Spain had basically zero electricity disconnections, and France and Ireland were also very, very low. So those countries have got a sort of mostly liberalized market, not like Hungary where the government dictates the price. So about 0.5% of household customers were being disconnected in those countries. But if we look at the national electricity market outside of Victoria, it was 0.23%, just half the rate that they had in those countries. And Victoria was very low, 0.003%. Now that sounds wonderful, but if you're one of these people who is being disconnected, it's horrible. And if you are one of the persons who is at risk of being disconnected, then from an experience level, it's not a nice situation to be in.
No, of course not. So how do you explain that? You said that some of these other countries prohibit disconnections, so it's sort of seen as a last resort measure. How do you explain why you're surprised in terms of the rates?
Well, surprised because rates are put forward as an indicator of how protected householders are. But if you think about why they may be so low, then it may not translate into the real experience. So we know that it's not as cold in Australia, even if you live in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And I'm wearing a jumper and you are in the summer top.
I am.
People compromise on heating or on cooling, if you're in a hotter climate. And that's why our bills may not be quite as high, or the share we spend on our energy may not be quite as high. So a lot of my work looks at indoor temperatures, for example, because living in a cold home in Europe is an indicator of energy poverty or not being able to heat your home. If we look at Australian homes, and I've looked at homes from low income to very wealthy income households. And hardly any home is meeting the World Health Organization guidelines of 18 degrees minimum temperatures. So we are not using energy to the extent that is healthy. And if you look at renters, for example, in Victoria, rental homes have to have one fixed heater now, but only like in one room, like the living room. If you've got bedrooms that are not as close, maybe you've got 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, you need additional heaters in these bedrooms because otherwise they'll still be cold, and with cold comes condensation and mold. So you need electric heaters that are portable in there. So people are just not using electricity or energy in general to live in what would be considered a healthy home.
Yeah, a healthy
Absolutely.
home. Yeah.
And it's a different conversation why people aren't doing it.
And also, we would not really have a full grasp on the figures, the number of people that are basically working around the disconnection, the lack of comfort that they have to go through in order to ensure that they are not disconnected. We probably have no idea of how many people do that.
Very, very little information on that. We know that people are compromising. We know they are not eating, especially older people, for example. They prioritize paying their bill, and they will rather go without food or medication or medical appointments to pay their bills. And it's really interesting how the system works. When we talk to financial counselors, for example, you have to reach out to your energy retailer and say, I've got problems paying my bills. And then they will put you onto a hardship program or a payment plan, for example. But many older people are just too proud to do it.
Or unable.
I've talked to people who can't hear the person on the other.
Yes.
And, because they've got hearing acuity issues, they can't hear the person on the other side. Very often it's more sort of online, and so it's got all these other things around it. And or sometimes you need to default, you actually don't pay your bill, and then things trigger as well. But a lot of older people, especially, they are too proud, they won't do it. We've heard of Burmese families. They group together to make sure that every one of the families can pay their bill on time, because then there was the pay on time discount that we used to have, for example. So that was a kind of coping strategy, was community oriented, and they were going around and making sure that everyone could pay their bills. Children can't go to school camp, for example. So there are all these stories, but people are often too proud to talk about it. It's only when we have research projects, especially when we talk to their carers, social and community groups and services who deal with them all the time. That's when you hear it. Yeah, and then if you get disconnected, for example, your fridge isn't working. If the fridge isn't working, it's a child safety issue, and then child protection officers may actually take the children away. So we've heard of people who were disconnected, but then plugged in their fridge, via a common plug, or, took it over to the neighbors so the child protection officer wouldn't see that there wasn't a working fridge. So it's these real stories behind that we don't know that much about, because people are private, and there's a lot of shame associated with being disconnected for not being able to pay your bill.
Does this come down to a fundamental problem or tension that we have? Our electricity market is fundamentally designed around commercial principles. Companies that need to make money to cover their costs, but also to make a profit on one hand. But electricity is a basic necessity of life. Are those interests totally at odds to each other?
That's a really interesting point that you raise, because having electricity and enough electricity has become such an important part of living a modern life and having a dignified modern life and being able to participate in life and being productive and healthy, just like water is. So there are a lot of people, organization, advocacy around the world who are really advocating for the right to electricity. So it can be either an implied right in the right to decent housing, for example, or it can be a derived right. And there are a few United Nations frameworks, for example, that actually spell it out. So if you look at the rights of women, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, they actually spell it out that women need access to electricity. We've got the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is affordable and clean energy. And one of the goals is access to electricity. So that is an implied right. We do have it for water, interestingly. So in Australia, if you cannot afford your water bill, your water supply may be reduced, but it's never cut off completely.
Right.
In Ireland, householders don't even get a water bill.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So when it comes to the water industry, and mostly that's privatized as well, at least in Ireland and in France and Australia, sort of the social welfare obligations take priority over market interests.
Okay, we'll take a short break and we'll be back after this message from our sponsor.
G'day, Alex Carey here, proud ambassador for GoodWe. The GoodWe ESA 3060 all-in-one commercial solution is available now from GoodWe wholesalers. With a massive 50 kilowatt hours of the battery eligible for the federal rebate, it's the perfect solution for small businesses. The commercial energy storage range from GoodWe is growing, with more models launching soon. Visit goodwe.com.au for more information or contact the local GoodWe team.
My guest today on Switched On Australia is Nicola Willand, an associate professor at RMIT University. She's in the School of Property, Construction and Project Management. And Nicola's research sits at the intersection of energy and housing, health and equity. And we're talking today about her research into electricity disconnections for bill-paying customers. You did say that in some countries disconnections are prohibited. Do you think that they should be prohibited here in Australia? Do you think that we should force it back onto the industry, onto government, to actually come up with some better ways to ensure that people aren't disconnected?
So the only time we've had a universal electricity disconnection ban in Australia and in these European countries we looked at, and almost in every country around the world, was during COVID.
Right.
And there was an prohibition to disconnect people from electricity for all customers. So in none of the countries we looked at, so none of the European countries at the moment, have got electricity disconnection prohibitions for all customers or all the time. So there were different types of disconnection prohibitions that we identified, but none of them is a universal one as it is for water, for example. And we found these 4 different types. One is sort of year-round legal disconnection prohibitions for certain customers, for example.
Vulnerable households.
Yeah, if they're vulnerable and, different definitions there. Then there were sort of grace periods where people weren't allowed to be disconnected. And some countries or some retailers just reduced the supply. Then there were sort of seasonal disconnection prohibitions, like over winter. None of them was for summer. And then voluntary ones where energy companies said, well, for our customers, we will voluntarily no longer disconnect them from electricity. And then sort of with supply restrictions and or not. So 4 distinct types, but none of these countries was still using the universal no electricity disconnections for anyone at any time that we had in COVID.
Those companies that have voluntarily said that they won't disconnect customers, what impact has that had on their businesses, for instance? Because that's where the resistance would be, that companies wouldn't want to do that voluntarily because they're going to lose money.
We don't have independent research looking at that. We only have what the electricity companies have said about it, and we don't know what the householders think about it either. But we know, for example, that EDF in France, which is probably the biggest electricity provider and retailer, and the state government, the French government has got a stake in that as well. They did trials before they did it for everyone, and they found that there was actually a 33% reduction of disconnections in a 5-year trial period. And they also found that 80% of the customers who get like a reduction of electricity rather than being cut off completely are re-engaging with EDF to find a financial solution. I mean, in the national electricity market, that's what you need to do as well. As soon as you reach out to your retailer and you say, I'm struggling, I want to be able to repay it, installments, whatever, then they can't disconnect you. So it's really important to push that out. But there are people who are not engaging with their retailers, and then often these hardship plans, the payment plans are not suitable for people. So they can't actually meet the repayment rates, and then they're still at risk at being disconnected. So we know from work that the Australian Energy Regulator has done that there is still a large number of hardship customers and payment plan customers who do get disconnected. So we know that system is not working 100%.
No. Yes, and given all those reasons you suggested why people don't approach their electricity company, do you think that we need to compel the companies in some way to reach out to the customers that are vulnerable?
So they're doing it to a certain extent. I mean, they have to write letters, etc., and they have to give warnings so they don't cut you off immediately. There is a sort of reminder period, and then you get a disconnection warning, and then you will be cut off. There are some retailers that have signed up to the Knock to Stay Connected campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So they voluntarily actually go out physically to homes that are going to be disconnected very soon to speak to people, and that has proven successful because people are dealing with a lot of issues often, and they don't see it, so they leave postcards. They actually go there face to face just to help them engage with their retailer. But not everyone is doing it, so that's a voluntary thing, but it seems to be successful. But the question is, what do you do? If you can't pay your bills, the debt just accumulates. And the idea is, well, you disconnect, then they will engage. So that's why it's called last resort. But the question is that really the best way of helping customers also get over their financial stress and then to be able to participate again? The other energy company in Europe, which voluntarily doesn't disconnect people any longer, is in Catalonia, which is an autonomous region of Spain, and it's called Endesa. They had an arrangement with the Catalonian government, then said, okay, we will stop disconnecting people, and they also waived their debt because they knew people were so over-indebted. European electricity companies are making a lot of profit, just as Australian ones are doing. So I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, we can assume that. Yep.
Yeah. So, there are great reports out there on how much profit they're actually making. So they just waived the debt, of 85,000 vulnerable households and said, okay, that's it. Breathe and we'll start again.
Yeah.
That was sort of the past debt. It didn't address future debts. So, but, it helped. And now they're no longer, switching them off.
Do we need to consider something like that?
I don't think it'll hurt. I don't think it'll hurt that much. I mean, if you look at the reputation that electricity companies have, it's not that good. So
It's down the gurgler.
Yeah, so maybe just doing it voluntarily may actually help them, improve their reputation.
Their brand.
A few companies, at least in Victoria, have been fined heavily because they were disconnecting people that, weren't supposed to be disconnected. That's a few. The European companies seem to be doing it. It's not ideal. For example, you have to be with EDF and you have to be with Endesa, which may not be the cheapest tariff. Even, that may be improved, but at least you won't be disconnected.
Do you think that signifies a growing awareness around the world that access to energy is a social right? Do you think that that's where some of these European countries, companies are moving?
Yes, I think it's the companies, but the governments as well. So both the government and the industry, they're increasingly acknowledging that affordable and uninterrupted electricity is key for human well-being in the world that we live in. So even the European electricity peak body said, we don't really want to disconnect people. We'd rather work with government to find solutions that circumvents that. Because also, if they disconnect people, that's probably bad debt. And the problem is if someone is disconnected, if you now go to another retailer and they look at your records, credit ratings are low, So it's really, really tricky. So rather not disconnect them and have other ways around it. And I was talking about, reducing the power supply, as we're doing with water, for example. What you need is a smart meter to do that. And Victoria, I think everyone's got a smart meter now, and the other states
No.
are probably.
we don't in other states.
Yeah, but I think it's an aspiration, and I think everyone's really working towards it because your bills are going to be much more accurate. You don't have to estimate it, but you can really take it from the smart meter reading. And also there are these apps and little devices that allow you to track your electricity use in real time. I think that is definitely a technology that allows other ways of working with customers. Yeah, and then the question is, what should the reduced power supply be, for example? So, for example, in Spain, if they reduce the power supply, you can still run your fridge, a television, and a washing machine. Whereas, for example, in France, they reduce it so you still have access to electricity. So you can have a lamp and you can have your fridge and you can charge your phone, but you can't run a washing machine, you can't use an oven, and you can't use an electric heater, for example. So, for Australia, it would be really interesting to understand what the limit there may be in different contexts. So
in different states and in different climates, really.
Absolutely.
And I mean, what you're really talking about are, I think, what they call minimum energy guarantees, which is, even if you owe money, the state is still going to ensure you receive a basic level of electricity.
Yeah, I think it's different in different countries. So I think in South Africa, for example, there is a minimum kilowatt hours which you then can't exceed. But then if you do exceed it, what happens then? Whereas there's always a trickle coming out of the side.
How does it differ? I'm not so sure how you mean.
It can be cumulative amount, let's say 500 kilowatts or something per month. You can have that for free. And I think India is always working on something like that. But then if you go above, then you pay. Or if you don't pay, then you don't have access. Whereas if you're reducing the power supply, it's still continuous.
Yes, right.
It's just reduced to how much you can use
at any given time.
At every point of time. I know that smart meters in France have been tampered with.
Yes.
But we're not doing it in Australia. So
don't give anybody the idea, Nicola.
I was fascinated. Like the union had this thing, and they wanted to show that they've got power too. So they went around and switched on everyone again, or tampered with the smart meters that it wouldn't record the electricity people were using. And 3 years ago, in 2023, I was in Valencia doing work on energy poverty there. We went into this neighborhood, lot of sort of low-income renters or illegal migrants living there. They were also tampering with the smart meters, and there was a whole market. Like, you knew where to go so that the smart meter wouldn't record every little kilowatt that they were using. So, and it's widespread in Spain, and there's been research on that where it was, people are doing it to game the system and it's not really unfair. But when the researchers then talked to householders that were practicing this, it was out of sheer necessity.
Yes.
And that has got risks, because if you're tampering, with electricity, there's a safety risk. But they did it out of sheer necessity because they still needed their phone. They still needed to be able to be reachable for work or whatever. People get desperate.
Yes, understandably. Just a final question. The clean energy transition is only going to succeed if energy access remains affordable and secure for everyone. As homes electrify and we replace gas appliances, etc., electricity becomes even more essential to daily life. Should households ever be completely disconnected from electricity in this electrified society?
Oh, I love that question, because there are two competing things. We talk about the low carbon transition, and it's all about electricity as a technical term, and the dwelling and the services. So very much an engineering perspective. But for people, for householders, it's not a dwelling, it's a home. So it's a social side, it's a cultural side of living, and all that different values beyond security and renewability and affordability of electricity or energy in general that play into their perceptions. And reliability is one of the key things. So if you live, as I do, high trees, whenever there's a storm, we lose electricity because one tree will fall onto a power line. They're all above ground here. And it happened, during COVID, for example, for 2 weeks, we did not have electricity. If you've got another form of fuel, like gas or wood, for example, that gives you resilience. And, I've talked to an older household, for example, who lived on the other side of the mountain. She was living in social housing, and they took her gas stove away because they said the open flame is a danger, for older people, and they gave her an electrical stove. The power went out regularly, and she wasn't even able to make herself a cup of tea. So, no heater because it was a reverse cycle air conditioner. So that was a real problem. So we really need to think a little bit broader when it comes to resilience, for example, to say, okay, electrify, but give people a battery that will work, for example, if there was a power outage. Security, yes, but it's about safety as well. So, for example, gas flames, you would think, oh, that's an open flame, but householders have told us, no, they think that's more secure because you can see the flame and you know if it's on or off, for example.
You can't see the toxic gases, though.
Absolutely. But how many people do you know who are using their gas and are switching on the exhaust, which is supposed to take most of the pollution outside? Until recently in apartments, that exhaust didn't even lead to the outside. It just came back at, under the ceiling.
Yes.
So it wasn't really extracting the pollutants. Yes, but then also thinking of householder practices, how they cook, for example. For Indian families, the heat of gas seems to be really important. And I've heard from householders that they say, if you cook on electricity, you heat up on the inside. And I said, what do you mean? And they say, well, you get angry. So the flame was really important for their health beliefs. So it's very different. It's not a dwelling, it's a home. If you switch to electricity, the affordability may still be a problem because you don't have options. You're just stuck on electricity. If you're on a demand tariff, for example, you're supposed to be using, most of the electricity during the day, for example, where you have a lot of renewable electricity and maybe there is a surplus of electricity in the grid and, people want to get rid of it. But not everyone has got the opportunity to do that. If you've got a factory job, you're not at home to switch on your washing machine or your dishwasher during that time. You are very unlikely to have a smart washing machine that you can program to switch on in the middle of the day. And if you're a family with young children, they come home after school, you need to have it cool there. You need to do the cooking there, you need to do the bath time there. So a lot of householders may actually not be able to make best use of the demand side tariff.
But I suppose the nub of it for me that I'm thinking is that if we are all electrified, and increasingly more and more households will be fully electrified, not all of them are going to have the solar and batteries that can keep their electrified goods going when the power's down, or, when you actually can't afford to pay your bill. I just wonder, with the transition, should we be rethinking whether or not we should not be disconnecting people from such a vital service?
No, we shouldn't disconnect people. Full stop.
Yeah.
I think that's because without electricity, the rest of your life is likely to stop as well. And when it comes to the electrification, low-income households may not have the means to buy the battery or the solar panels. I mean, it's not free. Yes, it's subsidized, but still, and low-income people often have low capacity for loans. They may have low wealth, so limited financial reserves. They don't have, a big car to sell to get the money. Not everyone's got the technical understanding to make these decisions and to operate smart devices, for example, for optimum outcomes. Renters and apartment dwellers, they've got very limited agency anyway. We've just finished a huge study on how people improve their homes and how energy efficiency retrofit goes into that. Well, they wanted solar PV, some of them, but their roof was in such bad shape. So, it was, oh God, I've got to do the roof first, then only I can have the solar PV panels or the power boards needed replacement. And importantly, there is a lack of information when we talk to people very often, about energy efficiency of their homes. They may say, solar panels, but not understand that insulation, for example, or shading, actually reduces the demand, makes the energy more affordable. And then there is trust. Who do you trust? For me, really surprising was how many women said, no, I've had bad experience with tradies. They were rude and they hadn't finished and they want me to pay their bill and they were bullying me, whatever. I'm not having tradies come into my home again. It's much more than just, switch over from gas to electricity. And, low-income households may not be able to do that anyway. They are left with the burden of the gas infrastructure costs. When we talk about gas bans or electrification mandates, we really need support for equitable retrofitting of people's homes. At the moment in Victoria, at least, the Victorian Energy Upgrade Program offers subsidies for all kinds of things. But again, it's a very democratic approach and everyone has access to it. And it's not sort of only targeting, for example, low-income households. Yeah, there needs to be, more awareness, more information, but also using relations to get the information. So when we talk to householders, how did you pick someone to do it, or how did you find out? Oh, it was my friend at water aerobic, so it was at church, or so it's these social relations that help disseminate information because it's trusted information. There also needs to be continued funding. A lot of the time there is just like funding for something, a subsidy for a year, and by the time you find out via your various friends and family, and then you call someone, the funding's gone, for example. Aiming for more social equity through targeted programs, for example, the Australian Capital Territory and South Australia, they're doing it with their subsidy programs for home retrofits, and also have a little bit of means of wealth testing. Very often we talk about low-income households, but we have a lot of low-income households who are very wealthy. So looking at that a little bit as well. So the Victorian Solar for Homes program, they have that. So it's not only the income that is means tested, but also the wealth of householders as well. So what's the value of the house, for example? So the Australian government one doesn't look at that, but there is evidence that looking at wealth may actually have more equitable outcomes. Yeah, and definitely looking at local trusted intermediaries, care services, social services, community groups. But that also means that energy and the low carbon transition, and how do we do it equitably, needs to sit across different ministerial portfolios, for example.
It's complex.
Yes, but I think there are ways forward.
Well, we've discussed some of them today, and we've identified some of the problems, Nicola. Nicola Willand, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast.
It was my absolute pleasure.
And Nicola Willand is an associate professor in the School of Property Construction and Project Management at RMIT University. As the energy transition gathers pace, making sure everyone stays connected will be just as important as how we generate the electricity itself. That's it for Switched On. Join me again next week for more news, views and ideas about the energy transition and electrification. I'm Anne Delaney. See you then. Switched On Australia was proudly brought to you by GoodWe. GoodWe's all-in-one ESA home battery helps Australians store more of their own solar energy and rely less on the grid. With strong local support and technology already trusted in thousands of homes, GoodWe is making the switch to electrification simpler and more affordable. GoodWe is proud to work with Australian cricketer and GoodWe ambassador Alex Carey. Find out more at goodwe.com.au. Switched On Australia is also proudly brought to you by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world.